In this video, let's learn about what are pure functions in JavaScript. Now, the idea behind creating a pure function is for two reasons. The first one happens to be with regards to consistency, and the second reason happens to be the predictability of our functions. Whenever we create functions, there are certain characteristics of that function which determines whether if it is pure or impure. One of the characteristics of a pure function is it returns the same result given the same arguments. That's the first characteristics of a pure function. Now let us try to understand this better through an example. So here what we have is we have an array called as fruits, which contains array of strings. We call the slice method by passing two arguments to it. We say fruits.slice 0, 1. What it returns is it returns an array of apple inside it. Now you need to keep in mind that this is a pure function because every time we call the method with the same arguments, it is returning the same result for us. So this becomes the first characteristics of a pure function. So the second one is the execution does not depend on the state of the application. So this is the second characteristics for the pure function. And the third one happens to be it does not modify the variables outside of their scope. Again, for point 2 and point 3, we will be looking at few coding exercises by the end of the video. So as we said, let's look at a comparison between a pure and an impure function. Let's start with a pure function. We know that a pure function at the end of the day has to have all the three above characteristics or the three requirements to call them to be pure. So what is the advantages of creating pure functions? So the advantage of a pure function is it becomes very easy for us to predict what happens within our function based on the input or the arguments that have been provided. It is easy for us to reason as to why the particular output happens or why we got the certain output. And then it makes our function more testable. So these are the three advantages of a pure function. So let's look at an example. We've already seen one of it where we've used the slice method. When we pass the same arguments, we get the same output. So this is one of the characteristics of the pure function. And let's look at our own user defined. So if slice is something predefined into the language, let's look at when we create a particular function, what makes it a pure or an impure function. So check this out. I have a function called as add, which takes two parameters, a and b. We return the value of a plus b. So the addition of the two parameters gets returned. Now we say that add is a pure function because it is not dependent on any value or it is not dependent on any state of our application. It does not modify the arguments that have been provided. And then importantly, it returns the same result given the same arguments. So if I pass 10, 20, it gives me the same desired output all the three times. Hence, we will say this add is a pure function in JavaScript. All right, let's look at an impure function, right? Quite obvious, if one of the requirement fails or if one of the characteristics is not present for a function, then we call that particular function as an impure function. So let's look at an example. We will look at both inbuilt methods as well as our own user-defined functions. So the first method that we're going to be checking out is the splice method. Now we say that splice is an impure function. Why? Because for the same arguments that we provide for splice, it always returns a different result. You can see if I call fruits is an array, fruits.splice 0, 1, first time it returns apple, the second time it returns mango, and the third time it returns kiwi. As you can see, since it is not returning the same result, we can say that splice is an impure function. Let's look at another example where this is a user-defined function of ours. We have a players array in the global scope. We have a function called as add player, which takes two parameters, players array and the name of the player to be added. And on line number 4, we're saying players.push of name. We return the value of our players. Now check this out. We say that add players is an impure function. Why? Let me just minimize this a little. Yeah, much better. We say add players is an impure function. Why? When we call that particular function with the same arguments, we are getting different results. So the first time when we say players and Dhoni, it returns an array of Dhoni. The second time I say players of Dhoni, it returns Dhoni and Dhoni. Why? Dhoni is already present within our array. So the first characteristic is not met. For the same arguments, we are getting different results. The execution doesn't depend on the state of the application. Here it is dependent on the state of the application, right? Why? Because we have players, which is an empty array. We have players, which is an empty array. And then we are passing that array as an argument to our function. So it is still dependent on the state of our application. Point number 3, characteristic is it does not modify the variables outside their scope, but it is not true. In this case, because players is an object, objects are passed by reference. Whenever we are adding, whenever you're manipulating the variable within the function, it is affecting the value in your outer scope. So it does modify the value in the outer scope, because let's say on the next line, if I say console.log of players, you know that players is going to be this array of Dhoni, Dhoni and Dhoni.